Hello, your friendly neighborhood host, JT Wheatley, back again for another episode of the History of Comics podcast, this time with the history of pulps, the precursor to American comic books. Before comic books exploded onto the scene in the early 20th century, one of the most prominent forms of entertainment was pulp magazines. Made of cheap pulp paper with extravagant covers, they told stories across all genres, from adventure to romance. It was in pulps that writers like Robert E. Howard, Arthur C. Clarke, and Robert Heinlein would find their beginnings, along with classic characters like The Shadow, Tarzan, Conan, and Zorro, who not only survive to this day, but inspire many classic comic book characters, from Superman to Batman. However, the very medium pulps would inspire would also lead to its downfall, though the style of stories they are told continue to this day. Pulps ran from the 1890s to the 1950s and would eventually consist of 900 separate titles and 40,000 individual issues before their demise. They were the primary form of inexpensive entertainment in America for the first half of the 20th century. They took their name from the coarse, cheap wood pulp paper used for the interior content, usually having rough, untrimmed edges. Their covers, though, were usually printed on glossy non-pulp stock that allowed for full-color printing. Typically, they were bound in 16-page signatures with a total page count of 128 to 144 pages, with dimensions of 7 by 10 inches to 8.5 by 11.5 inches. For the most part, this was the American phenomenon, though many were reprinted or printed overseas. Their main competition on the newsstands were the Slicks or the Glossies, magazines printed on higher quality paper, thus the name Slick and Glossy, which included Collier's, the Saturday Evening Post, and Cosmopolitan, whose stories were considered more high-minded. Pulp magazines gave rise to the term pulp fiction as well, referring to the run-of-the-mill, low-quality stories, and they were the successors of dime novels, penny dreadfuls, and the short fiction magazines of the early 19th century. The first pulp was created by Frank M. Mumsey, a newspaper and magazine publisher, who in 1882 published the Golden Argosy, a thin, dime novel magazine meant to be an illustrated weekly paper for boys. It was so successful he launched another magazine, Mumsey Weekly, in 1891. 2 years later, Mumsey had it renamed Mumsey's Magazine, expanding its size and turning into a monthly release, becoming another huge hit. Meanwhile, the Argosy, originally the Golden Argosy before being retitled in 1888, was struggling to find its niche, going through a series of format changes. Finally, Mumsey was inspired to make it an all-fiction magazine in October of 1896 and would see its circulation soar from 40,000 issues to 500,000. By December of 1896, Mumsey had the magazine printed on pulp paper, replacing its original higher quality stock, and as a result, some considered this the first true pulp magazine. Mumsey would further expand his new pulp line with All Story magazine in January of 1905, which was a general fiction adventure pulp with full-color cover illustrations. The stories in these magazines covered all genres, from romance to adventure to science fiction. Mumsey did get more specialized with Railroad Men's magazine in October of 1906, devoted to the tales of railroad and the first pulp to focus on a single genre. This was followed by The Ocean on October of 1907, which was later renamed Livewire after 11 issues, only to be finally canceled after another 7. In 1908, Mumsey added The Cavalier to much greater success, and that magazine would run for 163 issues before merging with All Story Weekly in 1914. For 7 years, Frank Mumsey had this new pulp field all to himself until Street & Smith, a New York paperback and magazine publisher founded in 1855, joined in with the popular magazine in November of 1903. However, Street & Smith had an added twist to their magazine, with Popular featuring full-color illustrated covers instead of the original words and black and white line drawings that Mumsey was using. In response, the Argosy under Mumsey would start color illustrations in October of 1905, though didn't go full color until December of 1912. Street & Smith followed with Top Notch magazine in March of 1910, which would switch to a pulp format on October 1st of that year, running for more than 25 years in 1930 to 1937. On October of 1915, Street & Smith published Detective Story magazine, starting the detective pulp genre. And then they would start 2 more genres, romance and sports, in pulps with Love Story magazine on August of 1921, followed by Sports Story magazine in 1923. Street & Smith would also later create another pulp genre in the 1930s with The Shadow in 1931, bringing about the hero pulps. Another publisher who entered the pulp medium was Story Press, who released a monthly story magazine in May of 1905. On October of 1906, it became the monthly story Blue Book magazine, eventually becoming one of the most prestigious and longest-running pulps ever made. From May of 1907 to January of 1952, it will be known as the Blue Book magazine, Blue Book, and Blue Book of Fiction and Adventure. In the 1920s, it is considered one of the big four of pulps, next to adventure, argosy, and short stories, and by the 1930s, it was called the King of Pulps. Writers that contributed to Blue Book included Edgar Rice Burroughs and Agatha Christie, while interior artists included Alex Raymond, the creator of Flash Gordon. Another of the big four pulps was Short Stories, which was made into a pulp in March of 1910, originally beginning as a more literary slick magazine back in 1890. The magazine was advertised as 25 stories for 25 cents, emphasizing the cheapness of the pulp entertainment, one of its main appeals. It was originally known for Western stories written by the likes of Max Brand and Ernest Haycox, but would also expand to adventure and humor. The magazine adapted a red sun as its symbol, which appeared on nearly every one of its covers, and by 1922, its circulation peaked at 899,000 copies per issue. In September of 1950, it published Robert Heinlein's novella Destination Moon, an adaptation of his screenplay for the film of the same name. Short Stories was later published by Doubleday and Page Incorporated and would run for nearly 1,000 issues to 1959. Adventure stories were the most popular of the pulps, with 140 titles. Argosy ran for 1,500 issues over 46 years. The final of the Big Four pulps that was published was on November of 1910, when Ridgway, an offshoot of the Butterick Publishing Company, released Adventure, having already published the slick Everybody's. It would soon become the king of adventure pulps, in large part under the editorial direction of Arthur Sullivan Hoffman, who ran the magazine from 1912 to 1927. Under Hoffman, a cadre of talented writers covered various adventure subgenres, from mystery to hobo, and he also had a talented assistant, Sinclair Lewis, who would later become the first writer from the United States to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1930, who created a popular identification card for readers, in which, if the bearer died, it informed whoever found it to turn it over to his next of kin of this hapless adventurer. In 1934, Adventure was brought on by Popular Publications, during which time it would feature writers like Malcolm Wheeler Nicholson, one of the future founders of DC. Adventure did 750 issues over 43 years, and would launch the career of T.S. Stribling with the story The Green Splotches on January 3rd of 1920, and he would go on to win the Pulitzer Prize in 1933. The magazine also enjoyed a pretty famous fan base, which included former President Theodore Roosevelt. On November of 1935, the magazine celebrated its 25th anniversary, with Time magazine called it the number one pulp, while Newsweek deemed it the Venture Pulp the dean of pulps. On April of 1953, the magazine was converted to a men's adventure magazine, where it would last until it was canceled in 1971. While many consider this the low point of adventure, it did publish stories from authors like Arthur C. Clarke, Armaments Race in April of 1954, and Norman Mailer with the Paper House in December of 1958. Of the other adventure pulps, Blue Book magazine, which ran 550 issues over 46 years, Short Stories ran for 450 issues for 44 years, Popular magazine went for 600 issues over 28 years, and Top Notch did 450 issues over 27 years. While fiction was the popular genre with adventure pulps, many also carried true stories, such as in Fiction House, Amazing Stories, Ned Pine's Thrilling Adventures, and Popular's Dynamic Adventures. In addition, many of the stories carried a sense of authenticity thanks to their writers, many of whom had first-hand experience in their tales, such as Captain A.E. Dingle, who was a sailor. The fiction stories covered everything from historical to fantasy, featuring such classic characters as Tarzan, Dr. Kildare, and Captain Horatio Hornblower, covering all subgenres of adventure pulps, from jungle to medicine to high seas adventure. Snappy Stories appeared in August of 1912 from William Clayton's New Fiction Publishing Company. This was cast as a lively and breezy pulp, soon to be followed by the Live Stories, Breezy Stories, and the La Parisienne. As time passed, these pulps would become more well-known for their risque content and covers, taking subjects such as adultery and premarital sex. By the 1920s, pulp covers started to spice up things as well. Westerns were another one of the more popular pulp genres, with 184 separate titles over a 40-year period, such as Indian stories, ranch romances, Northwest stories, and Civil War stories. Street and Smith produced Western Story magazine, and it was so popular it sold 500,000 copies in the 1920s. It evolved from New Buffalo Weekly in 1919. Western Story magazine first appeared on September 5th of 1919, launching the Western pulp genre and lasting to 1949. During its heyday, it was one of the most popular of the pulp magazines with a circulation of 500,000, and the magazine would attract numerous popular authors, noted as Max Brand, probably the most famous of his day. On December 25th of 1920, it featured his first story, Jerry Payton's Notched Inheritance, under the pseudonym George Owen Baxter, with editor Frank E. Blackwell. While popular, Brand considered his stories hack work, though wrote them to maintain his lifestyle, which by 1927 included a villa in Italy. Reportedly, he calculated how many pages he needed to do so, and once he learned it was 14 a day, Brand held that pace for years. He would later create MGM's Dr. James Kildare, which would command him a huge salary. The character first appeared in the Slick Cosmopolitan, before it became the women's magazine Cosmo, on March of 1936. Western Stories magazine's slogan was Big Clean Stories of Western Life, a theme carried into the covers, which depicted scenes of herding cattle and mending fences over lynchings and scalpings. Fiction House would join the Western genre with Lariat Story magazine, featuring stories by Walter J. Coburn, and Doubleday would publish The Frontier in the West. The 1930s saw more realistic stories in Dime Western and Star Western, while expanding to the Canadian frontier with Far West stories and Northwest stories, where the Canadian Mounties substituted for the Texas Rangers. Of all the story writers, the most popular was Max Brand, a.k.a. Frederick Schiller Faust. He used multiple aliases throughout his career at Western Story magazine, such as George Owen Baxter, David Mance, John Friedrich, and Peter Henry Mallard. War stories appeared in slick magazines like Collier's and Saturday Evening Post. However, the pulps would soon follow in magazines like Adventure, before specialized pulps like War Stories appeared in November of 1926 by Dell, birthing the war genre in pulps. War Stories focused on tales of World War I, then called the Great War, and Dell would soon follow up with war novels in February of 1928, Warbirds in March of 1928, Navy stories in February of 1929, submarine stories in April of 1929, and War Aces in April of 1930. Fawcett produced battle stories in September of 1927, focusing on World War II, and unlike Dell's books, featured more about the lives of the frontline soldiers over rollicking adventures. Battle Stories and another of Fawcett's pulps, Triple X, featured covers by Jerome George Rowan and his brother George Jerome Rowan, who were twins and World War I veterans themselves. George served in the Signal Corps while Jerome was shipped to France, though he never saw combat. Jerome, who had been to the Louvre while in France, had a more extensive art education than his brother, delivered a more painterly style to his covers, while George's were more animated. Fiction House joined the war genre, along with capitalizing on the world's newfound love of aviation and producing Air Stories on April of 1927 and Wings of December of 1928, focused on aerial combat. 1928 also would see an explosion of air titles in general, much of it inspired by Charles Lindbergh crossing the Atlantic and landing in France on May 21st of 1927, with other publishers producing pulps like Air Adventures by Clayton Magazines and Flying Aces by Magazine Publishers Incorporated. Like war pulps, many of these magazines sought out actual veterans as writers, like Arthur Gay Empty, who was a U.S. Cavalry veteran, or Arch Whitehouse, an RAF flyer. Robert J. Hogan would cross over the wall genre with the Hero One when he created G8, America's greatest flying spy, with his story G8 and his Battle Aces in October of 1933 from the popular publications. Detailing the adventures of Agent G8 and his faithful sidekicks, Bull Martin and Nippy Weston, they battled the forces of the Kaiser Wilhelm II, which included the Iron Mask Style Mask. With his success, Popular followed up with Robert Sidney Bowen and his Dusty Airs and his Battlebirds, who fought in a fugitive war against an Asiatic emperor. Even the more specialized pulps like Zeppelin stories and submarine stories were a staple of the war genre in 1929, but were ultimately as short-lived as their subjects. Of the great artists of pulps, N.C. Wyeth did the covers for Popular magazine starting in 1909, along with a New Story magazine and All Around magazine through 1916. J.C. Leidendecker was a slick artist who found success in pulps as well, working on Popular from 1908 to 1911. Frank Schoenwer, who, like Wyeth, was a student of the famed Howard Powell, did covers for Popular from 1913 to 1930, being exclusive to Street and Smith, as he did covers for People's Ideal magazine and Western Story magazine. Another student of Howard Powell was Harry Dunn, who also painted for Street and Smith from 1910 to 1915. Clinton Petey would work for Munsey and is most famous for painting the iconic covers of the October 1912 issue of All Story magazine, which featured the story of Tarzan of the Apes by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Patrick J. P.J. Monahan worked mostly for Munsey, while Frederick Small